The Chinese military is rushing forward in many ways every year, but it's the technological leaps that are perhaps most impressive. While today most of those advancements are based in domestic industry and technology, that was not always the case. This video will explore the period from the 1970s to 2000s, when many countries helped the Chinese military with technology transfers. Among those, Israel often comes up near the top of the list. This video will try to explain just how Israeli firms helped China develop its military technologies in the said decades, and ultimately how they helped the Chinese military get to where it is today. Hey guys, before we start, allow us a short word from our sponsor. What if you moved back in history and you're in charge of Yom Kippur War? Glory of Israel or nuclear catastrophe depends on your decision. What would you do? Sagar is the first-of-a-kind decision-making simulator based on historical facts. It allows you to check how a single choice would impact war results. Will you dare to change any decisions that were made? Stand in the position of the commander-in-chief during the Yom Kippur War and lead the Israeli army in Sagar. Check your thinking process and play the what-if game. You will race against time, struggle with incomplete information from the battlefield, and a tremendous sense of responsibility for the country's future. Will you be able to make good choices with the knowledge you got? Will you prove to be a great leader like Golda Meir? Now it's your turn. Take the lead and prove yourself as a commander-in-chief in Yom Kippur War. Go back in time and change the course of history with Sagar Interactive Strategy Simulator. Onto our video now. Back in the 1960s and during much of the 1970s, the Chinese military, while vast, was very low-tech. The Soviets were a threat to China during that period, rather than an ally, and the internal struggles due to the Cultural Revolution did not help either. But as the West approached China as a potential ally from the mid-1970s, and as the Chinese economy started to open up, many new opportunities arose for the Chinese military. Many countries seized those opportunities and from the late 1970s onwards sold either ready-made arms systems, weapons technology or dual-use technology to China. Sometimes it was via various privately owned firms, but sometimes it was also via government-to-government deals. Indeed, even the US sold arms to China in that period. Italy, the UK and especially France sold various arms as well. China was basically choosing which country to work with on which area of technology. But all those were large and powerful economies even back then. Compared to them, the Israeli economy of the 1980s was tiny. Yet for its economic size, Israel is alleged to have traded with China in defense deals way above its weight class back in the day. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Israel concluded between $2 and $3 billion worth of defense contracts with China during the 1980s. That figure was higher than the US arms sales and cooperation with China in the same period, not only in relative economy size comparison, but also in absolute nominal comparison. It has to be said that a lot of examples of cooperation that this video will mention have only been alleged, perhaps written about in news articles, but they have rarely been confirmed by either Israel or China. Unofficially, cooperation started around the mid-1970s, but it was very low-key initially. First large deals were signed from 1979 onward. A CIPRI study says over 60 defense technology deals were signed from 1979 until the year 2000. While the true extent of military deals will likely never be known, here are some of the more notable examples. China had fielded its first intermediate-range ballistic missile, the DF-3, in 1971, but later variants needed a longer range. And with longer range, guidance was an issue, as precision suffered. Israeli firms allegedly were paid to assist in guidance technology transfer for said missile. The DF-15 is also sometimes cited to have benefited from some guidance technology assistance from Israel. That missile was tested from the late 1980s to mid-1990s, and some variants of it are still in use today. However, there is little tangible info on any of those technology transfers, except for a 1988 Washington Post article mentioning them. In the 1980s, after China was impressed with the performance of the Israeli Patron 3 air-to-air missiles, it sought to buy both the missile and arrange technology transfer. It's one of the few well-documented technology deals. Some 30,000 missiles were assembled locally in China in a license deal. The Chinese copy, the PL-8, entered service from 1989 onward. The PL-8 was a huge step forward in infrared seeker technology for China, and subsequent missiles benefited from that tech transfer a lot. The PL-9 missile, exported widely by China, basically mates the PL-8's body and internal components with PL-5's fin layout. It is also said Israeli firms had sold various night vision system technology as well as radio tech and electronic warfare and electronic signal measurement technology to China during the 1980s. But there's little actual proof to such smaller low-key deals though. A fairly big deal was alleged Israeli assistance in modernization of Type 59 tanks for China. While the said tank originally dates from the late 1950s, it was still used in huge numbers by China in the 1980s, so China wanted to modernize it. Israeli firms allegedly helped in the late 1980s and early 1990s with that effort. Not only did said firms provide reactive armor technology, fire control technology for the gun, armor-piercing technology for the gun rounds, but they provided the gun itself, a 105mm Israeli variant of the venerable British L7 gun, which Israel had a license for. A 1988 Sunday Times article said Israel sold radar technology that was used by the Chinese Navy. SIPRI alleges said deal was actually an electronic emissions gathering system, a passive radar if you will, which was ultimately installed even on China's Han-class nuclear-powered submarines. Israeli technical advisors were quite active in China in the 1980s. China too sent its own engineers and scientists to Israel during the 1980s. In 1990, the office of the Israeli Academy of Sciences opened in China. Anti-ballistic missile technology was also supposedly traded, with Patriot missile system tech finding its way to China, supposedly via Israel. A 1992 government-ordered review in the US concluded there was no evidence that Patriot technology in China came from Israel. However, there was no denial that China did get access to some of the Patriot's technology. But it was aviation technology that was at the forefront of sales. From the mid-1980s onwards, delegations from the Chinese aerospace industry were visiting their counterparts in Israel. This image shows them posing in front of the Israeli Lavi fighter. Now, a lot is sometimes said about Lavi being the basis for the Chinese J-10 fighter. Some even go so far to call the J-10 a Lavi copy. Certainly, there are sufficient differences between the two that the J-10 can't be a copy. But the fact remains that Chinese engineers did not have meaningful experience with successful canard designs in the 1980s. It would be only natural for China to work with Israel and learn about various aspects of Lavi's design, like control laws for a Delta canard type plane, for example. And they could have learned about other subsystems too. There were allegations over the years that avionics tech and specifically the heads-up display tech benefited from cooperation with Israeli firms. A US Senate report mentioned guided missiles technology as well. It suggested information related to US-made AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles was handed over to China. In-flight refueling technology was also at times alleged to have gone from Israel to China during the 1980s. Trying to leverage the accusations of the time, David Ivry, director of Israel's defense ministry, said that Israel gave China only a small amount of aircraft technology, that no US technology was given to China, and that Lavi technology that was given was already old at the time. Its plausible aerospace tech transfers were still going on during the mid-1990s. During the late 1990s and 2000s, the J-10 was touted as the most advanced Chinese-designed fighter. In 1994, Israel and China agreed on a sale of 50 unmanned Harpy drones. Those were designed to detect emissions from enemy radars and to fly towards said radars, essentially ramming themselves into radars, kamikaze style. Such weapons were not really exported around the world before then, as Harpy drones were regarded as novel high-tech weapons. Those Harpies would be involved in a scandal in the 2000s, but more about that later. In 1994, Israel's ELTA, dealing in radars, started negotiations with China on selling 4 to 8 airborne early warning radars. The contract for 4 was signed in 1996, and Russia was on board supplying the planes, Ilyushin 76, as the carriers of the radar system. The deal seemed to be going fine for a few years. A Russian plane was delivered to Israel for the integration of the radar system in 1999. Then, in the same year, the US government applied pressure to stop it all. Finally, in 2000, the deal was cancelled before any of the planes with radars flew to China. While China did not get its hands on the Israeli radar directly, it's quite plausible that a lot of the information had to be shared from 1996 until 1999. At the very least, Chinese engineers likely learned about how to integrate a radar system onto the Illusion 76, which they later did, as a domestically developed radar, visually very similar to ELTA's, flew on those very same Illusion 76 planes several years later. While China eventually did produce aerial radar platforms on its own, it's likely Israeli assistance sped up their development. Today, the Chinese fleet of early warning planes of various types is second only to the US one. In 2005, China sent some of the previously bought Harpy drones back to Israel for maintenance. The US wanted Israel not to send the drones back to China. Some sources claim modernization of drones was also in the cards. From then on, Israel pretty much ended any sort of military cooperation with China, as new laws were enacted in Israel. Further cooperation would be only for non-military tech, though that too could be sensitive. In 2006, there were accusations that an Israeli businessman, Efraim Menashe, set up a firm in 2002 with the goal of transferring unmanned aerial vehicle technology to China. Allegedly, Mr. Menashe arranged for various Israeli individuals, some of them ex-military personnel, to work in the said firm. While Mr. Menashe was ultimately released back then, in 2021 he was arrested again, this time accused of selling non-line-of-sight attack missile technology to China. While direct military contracts slowly dwindled in the 1990s, they were still considerable. Given that various NATO countries stopped weapons tech sales to China after 1989, Israel was basically the second biggest arms exporter to China in the 1990s, after Russia. As said, in the 2000s, those sales basically ended, but dual-purpose civilian technology deals still went on. Chinese Lenovo bought Israeli Vertex VC, for example, which dealt in mobile communications. Huawei opened a development center in Israel. In the early 2000s, Israel also formed joint venture companies based in China to promote technological and commercial cooperation between the two countries. Those included scholarships to Chinese graduate students in science and engineering. There were joint research projects in nanotechnology, novel materials, satellites, software, data telecommunications, and electronic-controlled optics. Between 2008 and 2011, high-tech goods accounted for 50% of Israel's exports to China. Those were mostly electrical machinery, electronic integrated circuits, communication systems, and so on. Those have been alleged to have helped the development of the Chinese telecom sector and aerospace sector, and could have more directly helped in defense matters when it comes to command and control, communications, surveillance, recon, and cyber warfare. It has to be said that such dual-use technologies are traded all around the world by all the developed countries. Indeed, the US, UK, Germany, and others likely traded far more in such technology with China than Israel did. But when it comes to dedicated military tech, Israel does hold a special place in China. After Russia, it still likely remains the second biggest trading partner in defense matters, historically speaking. Even if certain countries like France and the UK might have come close in the 1980s, as they also traded a lot of defense tech to China back then, those were all much bigger countries with much bigger economies. In that context, Chinese and Israeli defense cooperation from the late 1970s to early 2000s was more thorough. And while China's military would still be very potent today even without Israeli input, it would have gotten where it is today some years later.